Hi, I'm Claire Mitchell, QC. Welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. I'm a lawyer who specialises in miscarriage of justice cases, and we're bringing you this podcast because we want to tell you about the women who were accused, prosecuted, convicted, and ultimately executed as witches in Scotland.
I'm Zoe Venditozzi, and I'm a writer who's always had an interest in the witches, and I feel that this dark mark against Scotland needs a reckoning.
The campaign Witches of Scotland wants three things. Firstly, a pardon for all those convicted of witchcraft. Secondly, an apology for all those who were accused as witches. And finally, a national monument in recognition of all those who are affected by this terrible miscarriage of justice.
Over the forthcoming weeks, we'll be talking to a whole host of experts about the history and the modern day connections to the Witches of Scotland. Hello and welcome to the Witches of Scotland podcast. You're not going to believe it, guys, but we've only gone and made another episode, and this time it's episode 51, okay, of 6. So thank you so much for listening. This a whole incredibly long time, it seems. But this week we have really got a tremendous episode. I really enjoyed recording this week's one. Fascinating. It's got its ups, it's got its downs, gripping. I like this week's one. So that's a good one. But before I go on to say who we are talking to today and outline that one, Claire, I was just wondering, has anything happened that you'd like to talk about in the news update section?
Has anything happened, you asked me, Zoe?
Has anything happened?
Anything off the top of my head?
Uh-huh.
We've only gone and pardoned all the women and men accused of witchcraft in Catalonia.
What now?
Yes.
That is amazing, isn't it? That is extremely good news, because 100 years ago, when we first started this podcast, and we were contacted by the Catalan magazine Sapiens about our campaign, and they were really quite taken with it. So it's lovely to see they've got to this point. So what has happened with Catalan for those that have not listened to that episode from yonks ago?
Okay, well, first of all, if you want to listen to that episode, I think it is episode 29. It's with the editor-in-chief of Sapiens, Sonia Casas, and she spoke to us about how their campaign started. So they'd seen our campaign on the internet and they thought that they would like to do something themselves, but they had quite a lot of bigger budget than we did, Zoe. And they decided to bring out one of the magazines all about the history of women accused of witchcraft in Catalonia. And it's a beautiful magazine, really thick, got loads of detail in it. And they had an article from us in it as well. They'd interviewed us about the campaign. And they had on International Women's Day last year, 2021, an inaugural event, which, don't think about it too much, really, you'll start crying again. We couldn't go to because COVID.
Claire, if only we had baked a massive cake and had the cake delivered to Catalan, we could have jumped out of it like some modern campaigning Marilyn Monroe type ladies. That would have been the perfect cover. If we'd known then, all it needed was a little bit of baking,
exactly.
Some engineering know-how.
Yeah, we should have worked that out. Just as you say, a little bit of flour, a little bit of water, a little bit of icing.
Again, though, it shows that you and I are not witches, because if we were, we would have known that that was the way to get a party going.
Exactly. Not a party. Not a party.
Because it would have been a work. It would have been a work event, Claire.
It would.
It would have. Damn it. Anyway, sorry.
So in Catalonia, they put to their parliament that the people accused of witchcraft should be pardoned, and a resolution was passed in that regard. And I'm taking now from various articles we've had from Euronews, from the BBC website, from The Guardian, and also Sapiens has been in contact with us, and the editor-in-chief, and Pau Castell, who is a professor of modern history at Barcelona. They're going to come and speak to us. Incidentally, that might be our next podcast. We'll see how we can get them recording goes. But anyway, I'm taking from all these sources the information that I'm going to give you. So Catalonia's parliament formally pardoned hundreds of women who were executed for witchcraft between the 15th and 18th centuries. MPs in the Spanish region approved a resolution on Wednesday that, and it's described as, rehabilitates the memory of more than 700 women who were tried, tortured and executed. Apparently, MPs said that they were the victims of misogynistic persecution and also have called for some of Catalonia's streets to be named after the women who were persecuted witches. So that's brilliant. Again, we've already got people working that listen to the podcast and have followed the examples of some of the people that we have spoken to that are trying to get streets named after people killed as witches. So that was brilliant. The Sapiens magazine, along with Professor Prue Castell, were the ones that researched this, and particularly apt just for today because it's blown an absolute hoolie outside. It was said that witches were frequently blamed in Catalonia for the sudden death of children or for natural disasters like storms and for poor harvests. The Catalan Parliament passed the resolution to pardon over 700 people, again the majority of them women. And there was apparently a TV3 documentary entitled Witches, the Big Lie, which was on in Catalonia. And the Catalan president, Per Aragonès, I'm very, very sorry if I've butchered that, described the witch hunts as institutionalised femicide. According to Pau Castell, witch hunts were more common in Catalonia than other parts of Spain because rural areas came under the absolute power of feudal lords, and confessions alone were sufficient proof of guilt. So they didn't need anything else at all, Zoe, other than torturing people. They would then confess, and that was enough. What's really interesting, and hopefully we'll speak to Pau about this, was that when the Inquisition was called in to these cases, the inquisitors actually, on many occasions, set people free due to lack of evidence. So it's so funny that we think of the Inquisition as the terrible, torturous time when people were killed. And of course they were, but it's quite interesting that in comparison to the feudal landlords that were carrying out these trials and investigations, you had a better chance with the Inquisition than you did with them. Apparently, according to historians, people there who were accused of witchcraft were often practitioners of traditional medicine or women of independent means who were, quote unquote, regarded with suspicion. Isn't that interesting? A woman with her own means would be such a thing to be feared. In the Guardian article that we've read, I saw a quote from an author called Yvette Eroles. Again, terribly sorry, I'm sure that's not the right way to pronounce things, who is the author of a book on witchcraft in Catalonia, makes reference to a feminist slogan, "We are the granddaughters of the witches they couldn't burn." But he points out, in fact, that it's more to the point to say, we are the descendants of those who murdered them. We are the oppressor's heirs. So it's quite interesting that we always think of ourselves as the people who are descended from women and men accused of witchcraft. And of course we are. But also we have to acknowledge simultaneously, we will also be the descendants of the others.
And that's something that's really interesting that actually has come up in different conversations that we've had with people about sort of the pros and cons of pardons and apologies and so on, is that interestingly, people do, of course, take the part of the victims, of those that were accused, and are kind of like, well, what's the point in apologising today? But it's really interesting to think of that in terms of we're probably more likely to be descended from those that were on the other side of it. That's really fascinating, and I hadn't really thought about that.
No, isn't it interesting that we think about them and you think, well, we're women, they were women.
Identify with the oppressed rather than the oppressor.
Yeah, but in fact, our history is the history of the oppressor as well as the oppressed.
That's where the parallel with issues such as the transatlantic slave trade sort of come in as well, you know, like the sort of the benefit of being on the money-making side of that rather than being on the oppressed side of that. That's so interesting, really fascinating. So,
Zoe, I was interested to try and find out what the voting was in the Catalan Parliament when they passed it. And I'm absolutely delighted to see a huge majority of MPs in the Catalan Parliament passed it. 114 MPs voted in favour of the pardon, 14 were against it, and 6 abstained from voting. So that's, I think,
remarkable.
A landslide. Yeah.
That's really good.
It'd be interesting to know the makeup of the 14 that were against it, or why the 6 abstained. Maybe we'll get more info on that when we speak to those in Sapiens next week.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, cool. That's great.
So that's not our only news though, Zoe. We also had some other news last week about resolutions passed.
Yes, exactly. We have some closer to home. In West Lothian, there was a motion that was put forward by SNP councillor Moira Shemmelt to support our campaign for justice. It's really exciting. So Councillor Shemmelt's motion said, and I quote, "Council will instruct officers to write to the First Minister outlining its support for the above campaign, in addition to reiterate the request of the campaign that the First Minister makes it clear on International Women's Day 2022 that the Scottish Government accepts that what happened to those accused of witchcraft was a terrible miscarriage of justice, and to apologise on behalf of the people of Scotland." So they also have put forward that they are keen to back our campaign for a national monument, a state monument. And Councillor Shemmelt said to the meeting, "I can imagine folks sitting here asking, why on earth does this matter when it happened so long ago? And my answer to that question is that history is inescapable. What happened in the past informs our present and our future. Memory makes the map that we carry around with us. It informs our view of society," which I think is amazing. She was talking particularly about her area in West Lothian. There was obviously issues with witch accusations, hunts and trials there. I'm just going to give you some information about what happened there. So there were burning stakes on Cunninger Hill in Mid Calder, which is known locally as Witches' Knowe, in 1644. And the tortures and executions were overseen by a local minister by the name of Hugh Kennedy. Among the accused were Agnes Vassey, Agnes Bishop, Marion Gibson, and Margaret Thompson. The latter was acquitted after some horrendous treatment, including beatings, sleep deprivation, and being forced to stand for 26 days. Agnes Bishop confessed under torture, and she said that she was a common charmer and a heinous and notorious witch. Really absolutely terrible. They were accused in the 1600s, and there's also, it's not just them, there were other witches as well in West Lothian, including Margaret Alexander and Barbara Parish from Livingston. They were executed in 1647. And Janet Bruce, who was from Nether Williamston, which apparently is an area of Muirston Road, which I presume is still there, was convicted in 1644. So, I mean, that was some 378 years ago, the Cunninger Hill executions. So it's really nice to see that that is being looked at now and taken so seriously. And I think the quote there from Councillor Shemmelt is lovely. I love the idea that our past is a map that we carry around, and it really sort of chimes with what Claire and I are always saying about this, that it's something that we need to know it's important to recognise it to be able to move forward in time. And I also noticed in a funny little thing there that one of the witches, accused witches, obviously, one of the women, was actually called Marion Gibson, which is strange, Claire.
That is genuinely weird.
That's very odd, because our guest today is in fact Marion Gibson. Not that Marion Gibson, obviously, but our guest today is Marion Gibson, who we have had a lot of contact with on Twitter, and we're very excited to get her onto the podcast. So Professor Marion Gibson is an author and obviously a historian, and she teaches. She is the author of the book Witchcraft, the Basics, which came out with Routledge in 2018, and many other books on witchcraft and magic and history. She's currently working on 2 new books, The Witches of St. Osyth, I'm not sure. That's coming out with Cambridge University Press this year, and Witchcraft, A History in 13 Trials, which is coming out with Simon & Schuster in 2023. She lectures at Exeter University in the UK, and she is such a brilliant guest. So I think without any further ado, we'd like to welcome to the show Professor Marion Gibson. Hello and welcome to the podcast, Marion. We're so glad to have you on today.
Hello, Zoe. It's lovely to be on, and hello, Claire.
Hi, it's lovely to have you here. Marion, I first came across you on Twitter with your fabulous Twitter handle, Witches, etc. And I love your tweets and your facts and myth busting on the internet. So thank you very much for fighting what seemed like an unbearable tide of people giving out misinformation. It's really brilliant, the work that you do.
Thank you. It's good to know that that's noticed, and it's always a pleasure to tell people about histories of witchcraft. It's so interesting and it's so relevant today. How
did you end up making that sort of your specialist subject?
a coincidence, really. I mean, some people, you see, might think, oh, that was magical. But I think it's probably got a more prosaic explanation. And it's that when I was at university, when I was choosing my third year options, I wanted to do a couple of medieval history options because that was something that really interested me. And they didn't run because there weren't enough students recruited onto them. But the third one that I'd listed on my list of options that I wanted to do was one called Renaissance Magic. And then, I went along to it thinking, oh, this, it's probably really interesting. And I like the lecture and all the rest of it. But I was kind of slightly scared because I thought, I was I wouldn't say I was superstitious, but I was a bit of a wuss as a young woman. And I thought, oh, this might be quite scary. And of course, it was utterly fascinating. And in about week 4, we got given some trial accounts. And I immediately wanted to know more. I wanted to know more about what the women accused were doing and why they confessed in particular. Why did they tell these stories about themselves? Because I didn't really believe in my heart of hearts that they could have been witches and they could have done magic. So why were these women telling these stories? And that really came to matter to me.
That's really fascinating, actually, because it's something that obviously that's a big body of what's left paperwork wise is the confessions in Scotland, certainly. And some of them are really quite bonkers. And we were talking to somebody yesterday where we were explaining that there's sort of themes that are repeated and why that is it because it was kind of talked about and then it went into the consciousness, this is what witches did, or is it because they were getting these answers fed to them by the people that were questioning them? So we're pretty interested actually in the confessions. Maybe you can shed some light on us for that. So maybe the first question is, why did people confess to it?
I think those things you said are really relevant. It's kind of hard to imagine how the ideas began, isn't it? That's the really complicated bit. Why did somebody one day decide that people could keep a small animal familiar who was in fact a devil and that this would suck their blood? Who had that idea? That's a very strange idea indeed. But then when you think about how it enters into culture, you think about the rumors that fly around today, even on social media now, but also in ordinary life. We do come to look out for these ideas, don't we? Even if we think they're a bit mad, you hear somebody talking about something and you think, oh yeah, I read something about that. Oh yeah, my friend said that. And I think that's nonsense. I think it's a conspiracy theory, but I've heard that before. So I think explaining how they came to originate is really difficult, but how they spread, I think that's quite easy. And it is by gossip. And it's also by writing. The more people write these things down and the more people talk about them in court and the more people print them, and people take the pamphlet with the confessions in it down to the pub and they read it to their friends and they all have a chat about it, and it's terribly sensational. You can see how people got those ideas and they circulated in culture.
Can I just ask, I didn't realize this will just show how thick I am again. I didn't realize that there was pamphlets. So like a kind of a Penny Dreadful type of a situation where they would write them up and then it was like an OK magazine or something and people would talk about it. Oh, that's so interesting. It's
so interesting, isn't it? Yeah, it's brilliant. There are loads of them. And there are some lovely Scottish ones as well, which I can also tell you about. So they were like early newspapers, yeah. And one of the really famous ones is from 1591, the North Berwick witches, who I'm sure you're well acquainted with. There's a newspaper account of them. Isn't that amazing? And it gets circulated, it gets printed in England, so people across the whole of the British Isles hear about it. And then you find them being quoted in other places. So some of that transmission is by print. And, print is supposed to be this wonderful new thing that transforms the world, and the Renaissance happens and all this learning and enlightenment is shared and it's all great. But one of the things it shares is stories of witches. So it spreads belief in witchcraft and people's desire to take action against witches.
Just like bloody Twitter.
Yeah,
exactly.
Nothing's new. Nothing's new. It's such a granny. Nothing's new.
Yeah, exactly.
I've been the same.
Exactly. Social media is just the same. It's the same kind of, the internet is the same kind of revolution as the print revolution. And yeah, it spreads knowledge, doesn't it? It's great. We've been talking about how useful it is. It's put us in touch with each other. And that's one of the great things about it. But it also spreads misinformation and it spreads conspiracy theories and it spreads hate and people are horrible to each other on it.
There's something kind of reassuring in the idea that when print came into being, people were like, oh, it spreads bad things and conspiracy theories and hate. It's a new medium and it's very scary. And people do that with the internet as well. Obviously, sadly, the internet is a much more voracious beast that feeds upon these things. But in fact, the modes of communication aren't the problem. It's the humans. It's our wish to hear about gossip and be sensationalized and hear stories of magic and things like that.
Yeah, I think it is. I think these are persistent human fascinations, and we can't really get rid of them. It is really quite disappointing, isn't it? But on the other hand, the upside is that it gives us these wonderful stories. You know, we wouldn't have folklore and fantasy without these kind of beliefs, but they also have, of course, these terrible consequences, and people are persecuted because of them. So it's this double-edged sword.
We know in Scotland that confessions were usually done by keeping people awake, and now which is what's seen as one of the most serious types of torture. And ironically, it wasn't seen as torture then at all, because you weren't physically doing things to somebody. In England and Wales, we hear that the type of torture was sometimes different. Is that right? Was it more physical?
It varies really. The torture you describe, which, as you say, people at the time did not think was torture, but you know, the keeping people awake and walking them up and down until they were disoriented, that happens in England as well. So it happens in the case of the Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins, in the 1640s. He's very proud of his techniques of getting information out of people in those ways. But there's also other things. So in England, it was more common that people would be thrown into water to test whether or not they were a witch. That seems to have been less common in Scotland, although you can never be entirely sure, because some of these accounts, you know, it's the odd account here and there, and have the records survived of other ones. So there are questions to ask about, you know, the data, if you like. But yes, people would be thrown into water, and as people probably know, you know, if they sank, this was all good, and they were a normal human being, not a witch, and they were not guilty. But if they floated, well, they might be a witch.
So now, can I check this? Because this story like pervades over and over, and in Scotland we were saying, no, we don't find examples of that. If you sunk, would they then fish you out because you'd sunk and then you would still survive, i.e. they wouldn't just wait as you sunk and then said, that person wasn't a witch, we've killed them?
Yeah, that's right. They would pull you out.
So you let yourself sink then?
Yeah, exactly. No, that's something that's always bothered me. One of the reasons that you might not sink would be that you would be tied up. So you wouldn't be able to allow yourself to do that, really. And human bodies do float because they're full of air in the end.
Especially women.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's one of the reasons why people didn't. But you would think, wouldn't you, that knowing what we know now, if people wanted to badly enough, they might have been able to make themselves sink. But I'm also guessing they didn't know that much about physiology at the time. And, you know, they weren't given swimming lessons from the time they were 5 like we are. So I guess they didn't know that. But yeah, they would pull you out. So there are some lovely diagrams of this, actually, of how to tie somebody up and throw them into water. And one of the things you do is you tie a rope around their waist, and you have the rope leaning out to the side of them so that it goes onto the bank. So as they sink, presumably you leave them in there for a while to see if they really have sunk, which is of course horrible, and then you do pull them out, and hopefully hopefully they survive. But of course there are cases where people didn't.
And Marion, I read something relatively recently about the weighing of witches in Amsterdam. They weighed them, and the theory was that because they were able to fly on broomsticks, they were weightless. But that then doesn't work with the idea of making them sink. Oh no, it does it? Because
no, you were heavy to sink. So if you were heavy, then you would be witch in the weighing, because you were light, weren't the witches were light, yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, just to allow everyone to watch me trying to understand gravity there. That was a total insight into why I'm not a scientific person. So that worked. So the idea was that you would sink because you had weight, and if you had weight, you weren't a witch. Is that right?
No, it would be lovely to think that was the case, wouldn't it? But you're using modern logic, aren't you? Yes. And that seems perfectly reasonable.
Not very good logic, but modern logic.
But the logic people are using in the medieval and early modern period is completely different. So their explanation was that if you'd been given Christian baptism, you know, the holy water, God's holy water, had blessed you, and it was accepting you, and that you would thus be accepted by it if you were thrown into it. Whereas if you were baptized, but you then subsequently gone over to the devil, you would be rejected by it and you would float on top of it. So it's a completely different logic.
That's amazing. I've never heard that before. That's quite something.
We always say to people, you know, don't write off people of that time as being foolish or being ignorant. You know, these were their own cultural ideas that were thought out, and we might not agree with them now, but that does seem like quite a tremendously bonkers.
I know. If you speak to some people, you will also get modern, tremendously bonkers things that are, I mean, I don't know if you've heard of any conspiracy theories that are going on at the moment, Zoe.
One or two.
One or two.
Yes, yeah, you're right. Nanobots, yeah.
It's very easy, isn't it, to think people in the past must have been different to us. But, the more you talk about them, the more they're the same, actually.
Mm-hmm.
They had strange ideas and they built entire systems of belief upon them. So their entire world was structured by this binary idea that there's God on the one hand and his people. So on the other hand, there must be the devil and his people. So there must be witches and they must have certain laws that apply to them and they must have certain behaviours, which are often a kind of parody or inversion of Christianity. So once you started from that route, you can add almost anything onto that structure.
And so when we're coming back to the confessions again, what sort of things were repeated again and again in confessions? What became the kind of the real story?
You get a lot of stuff about making pacts with the devil. So, we've been talking about baptism, haven't we? And the idea that people are on God's side from that moment. But they're also supposed, depending on what, Christian sect you belong to get confirmed into the church. They're supposed to take certain vows and oaths in the name of God. And they're supposed, in some versions of Christianity, especially Scottish ones, to make a covenant with God and sign their name to it, when they're an adult and they're able to do so. So that gets inverted. And you hear a lot of stories where witches are saying, oh yes, I made a covenant with the devil, I made a pact with the devil. Maybe it was a written one, maybe it was a verbal one, maybe it was something to do with an animal familiar coming to them and offering them something. And then you get stories about the animals and you get stories about fairies coming to people and offering them things. So, if you'll only follow me and my way of life and, oh, by the way, make a pact with the devil, you will become wealthy, or you'll get the lover that you want, or you'll be safe from poverty, all of those kind of things. So you get the idea of people making pacts to get something that they wanted. And you get the idea also that they then use that magical power for harmful purposes. So, they get revenge on their neighbours who've upset them, or they do something to some key figure like the king or the local earl or somebody who they feel has done them wrong, or they don't like, or they think that person's on God's side. All of those kind of things. You get these stories repeated over and over again. And I think that's what we were saying earlier as well, that once you've told a story once, you can tell it over and over again and people start to believe that it is true, therefore.
Because the more sources you hear it from as well. So you say, oh, you read it somewhere and then your friends told you it, and then you're from someone else in the pub, if there was such a thing as a pub in those days, was there? The ale houses, I'm not sure. Then you start to think, well, there must be something in this, no smoke without fire.
Yes, you do think that, don't you? And we all think that about things. And again, it's back to that human condition, isn't it? There's a little bit in our brain somewhere that thinks, oh, well, that must be plausible because I heard somebody else say it or I read it. And these days, that's, I read it on the internet, it must be true. But, we all recognise that, don't we?
Yeah, the reading it on the internet, it must be true thing. That should be made a t-shirt for everybody to wear. We just all give about giving other people misinformation. It's a tremendous force for good, but it's also so scary. I want to ask you in particular, why was it women that were accused of witchcraft?
I think there are lots of reasons, but it's one of the big truths, isn't it? And it's easy to say, oh, well, witchcraft, the explanation for persecution, it's all very complicated. But one of the really big things that stands out in these cases is it's mostly women. So in Scotland, about 85% of the accused of whom we have records are women. That's a huge number. In England, it's even bigger, it's 90%. So that's really noticeable. And women seem to be accused because of this binary thinking in part. So, if you have God on one side and the devil on the other side, you have to pick your side. And the way that people think seems to be binary as well. So, we have men on the one hand and women on the other hand. And if you're going to associate them with particular groups, then in the end, you might end up associating one group more with one figure, God, and the other group more with one figure, the devil. And that's one of the ways that it seems to have worked. Demonologists, people who wrote theories of witchcraft, tended to say things like, women gossip a lot, they're loose-tongued, they're superstitious, they're malicious against each other, they're much easier to convince of things because, hey, they're gullible and they're not that bright, are they? And all of these kind of things might lead them towards the devil's party because they might believe the devil's lies. They might have malice against women in their family or their female neighbours. They might be jealous of them, for example. They're always chattering away amongst themselves. Who knows what they're talking about? It might well be spells and charms. All of these kind of things. And, I can see from your face, you're thinking, what?
No, it's a bit of a shame that we aren't recording this on Zoom to go out and see Zoe and I's faces of what? I mean, literally, is that what it is? Women are a bit stupid and they gossip a lot. They must be up to something. It must be them doing all the wrong things.
That's basically what you've been saying about John Knox, what John Knox said about women. It's just in more elegant language, the way he says it.
Yeah, women are the port and the gate of the devil. Is that what John Knox said?
Yeah, it's the same notion, isn't it?
To hear it from Marion just saying that it's really what it's all about. Men are upstanding and,
We see it every time there's something about the campaign on Twitter, though, like the answers, the sort of the responses from men, about, you stupid witch. And they're definitely not saying, it's a shame on the 15% that were men. It's absolutely honed in on the fact that these were silliness of women. And then it's sort of indicating that because we are women and we're campaigning for it, that we are also silly because we think that, that's of importance. I know I'm not saying anything that either of you've obviously never thought of this before, but people are quite shit to women.
They are, aren't they?
I'm coming to realise in my life.
They are. One of the discussions we're having here is about the continuity of history, isn't it? And it hasn't gone away. I used to think, I'm about 50 now, and when I started off my career in academia, I was, I thought, it can't be as simple as that, Of course it can't be as simple as that. And it isn't as simple as that, but it's one of the great truths. Yes, this is about people hating women. And it's really important to keep saying that. You can say all sorts of other things. You can say, it's about economic circumstance. And yes, that's important, but gender's part of that. Or you can say, it's about domesticity and it's about people fighting over domestic spaces and boundaries. Yes, it is, but gender's part of that. And you can say all sorts of things. It's about medical knowledge and who's supposed to have it and who isn't. Yes, but gender's part of that. Mm-hmm. It's about gender. And that's one of the things I feel like I'm put here to say, really. And I've come back to it as an older woman because I just think it hasn't gone away. And I think we sometimes forget to say it because we're so busy looking for other explanations, which are important and are contextually very important. But that central truth, yes, it's about women.
I think the reason that we sort of semi-shy away from it is because you don't want to be seen as being a harpy that's just going on about women's bloody rights, like it's 2022, you're still banging on about gender equality. Yes, I am. And I'm going to keep banging on about it until it's sorted, and I think that there is a massive disparity, like 85 to 15%. And I feel just as awful for the 15% of the people that were accused that were men. Obviously, I don't go, well, serves those buggers right. I only care about the women, obviously. But our understanding is that a lot of those men were dragged into it because of confessions by women. Has that something you've seen in your research?
Yes, it is. It does seem to be the case sometimes. I mean, it's, again, it's complicated. There's all sorts of things going on, but quite often the men are relatives of the women. So, you're pulled into it because your mother's been accused, or you're pulled into it because your wife has been accused. And they've suffered terrible fates too. It's, I think saying that most of the victims are women is not to say that many of the victims were men too. And imagine also the men left behind. Imagine if, your wife is accused and you can't save her, you can't protect her. This is a universal tragedy. This is something terrible that tore families apart. And it is important to say that. But it was usually the women who were taken away and tortured and imprisoned and ultimately killed.
I'm so glad that you've said it. You've said it is very complicated in one way, but in another way, there's a centrality of this that's really simple.
Yes, there is. And it's always the way with historical problems. Yes, it's complicated, but sometimes there is a truth that you have to talk about, and then the other truths fall into place around it. And I think it's one of those historical problems, witchcraft.
Do you think that the way that witchcraft has been remembered and studied by academics who would have been men have any impact upon the way we see the story of women as witches?
Yes, I do. And female academics have been saying this since the 1990s, really. It's become a bit of a debate within the field that, you know, sometimes male historians who live in a primarily masculine academic culture, as it still is, despite all the efforts to improve it and all the changes which have really positively impacted upon it, can only see things in a particular way because they're only having particular conversations. So yes, I think that has been the case. And there was a scholar called Diane Perkis in the 1990s who made that point very forcefully, essentially saying male historians are quite likely to privilege certain readings of history. We should get some female historians to look at this as well. And the field has changed since then. There is more acceptance of the idea that this is about women and the other factors are factors, but the gender factor is an important one. But I still don't think it's really heard often enough. And I think there is a slight shyness about saying it, which, you know, as you can tell, I'm no longer interested in feeling.
Yeah, it's interesting because I do sense that like this, it feels sort of almost impolite to keep saying, well, it was mostly women. And we do say that with, like, you know, one of the hashtags we had originally that Claire came up with was women not witches, you know, and they were, and that we get the odd little bit of people saying, well, what about the men? You know, and we're kind of like, well, you can do the maths between 85% and 100. There's a gap in between. So, you know, we do make it clear that there were men, obviously. We're careful about that. But it definitely is a feminist issue. It's a women's issue.
I think it is. I think it is. And sometimes people point to you and say, oh, well, you know, in the 60s and 70s, people might have thought that, you know, that's very second wave feminism. You can't possibly still think that. But actually, no, this idea is older than second wave feminism. And the statistics do speak for themselves. They really do. Even if you think, and it is true that there is massive loss of records all across the British Isles and Europe and beyond, that kind of disparity doesn't make itself up.
No, absolutely. I mean, the numbers are still there in what we've got left. So at least we can take that. And it's also, it seems almost universal. I mean, we've spoken to people all over the world that have spoken about witchcraft accusations. And the only ones so far that we can find out where the majority of men are in the Scandinavian countries.
That's right. Yes. So Scandinavia and Iceland, there is a big preponderance of men. And I think that's really quite interesting because it's kind of the exception that proves the rule. Once you see the difference, you think, oh, hang on a minute, there really is a disparity here. Why is it different here? And it's been argued, and I think quite convincingly, that in those Scandinavian countries, there's a preponderance of males being accused because there's more of a tradition of indigenous magic. So the people who live in the north of the world, the Sami, people who we might want to call Eskimos or Inuit, the people who live around the North Pole, they usually had shamanistic figures who were males and they practiced magic. And there seems to be some influence on the settler communities, the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Icelanders, who lived around them, where those people also start to think magic is a masculine thing, witchcraft is a masculine thing. There's something going on there about shamanism and knowledge and book learning and divination and maleness, which makes people think that men are the magicians there. But that doesn't seem to apply in the British Isles at all. It seems to be completely the other way around, and it's women who are associated with magic here.
There seems as well, we were saying this yesterday, Claire and I were talking about the sort of the sexual dynamic to the sort of the accusations and the confessions. You know, there's a lot of talk about the confessions that we've read about having sex with the devil and the devil's sperm being described as being very cold, icy cold. And it's Claire's just making a really vomitous face on the screen there just for the benefit of the podcast, for the benefit of the court. The witness vomits. There's a lot of discussion of that, and of course women dancing around naked in the woods together with other women, and it's all a bit kind of like, whoa, it's quite exciting. What does that tell us? Is it sexual repression that's driving this to a great extent?
I think yes. I think it would be fair to infer that was one of the factors, wouldn't it? Yeah. So yes, you know, once you've cast women as witches, and the devil is usually a male figure in Western culture and particularly British religiosity, you know, we regard him as him, Satan, Lucifer, and so on. The question comes to be asked eventually, doesn't it? So tell me about this pact. What exactly did you do? And the sexual element tends to enter in about that point, and people start talking about the devil as a lover. But I also think there's a really interesting fantasy element going on there. And yes, that might relate to this being a really very buttoned up culture and a culture that sees sexuality as problematic, especially women's sexuality. So some women will confess things like, you know, the devil was a handsome young man, and, you know, he was wearing a lovely lace collar and satin clothes, and he came to talk to me in the night and he made me feel special. Yeah, exactly.
His nails were short.
Yes. He seemed like such a nice guy.
Back of my head.
I think there's that going on, you know. I think there's an element of women thinking, you know, this is the fantasy lover. He's going to give me money and make my life nice and take me away. And there's this romantic element going on. But of course, for the questioners, this is all about women being dirty and you know, leaky and problematic and lustful and all the things that they think women are anyway. The trouble is these stories work so well for everyone. They work for the accusers, but sometimes they also work for the accused witch as well, which I think is one of the reasons why people confess.
What do you mean by that?
I think there's something in the stories that is satisfying to tell.
Yeah.
So, you know, if somebody says you are a witch, tell us about how you're a witch, and you're in a situation where you're, you know, you're tired, you've been physically assaulted in some way or put under stress in some way. You know, you're frightened and you want to go home, and this wealthy gentleman is asking you these questions, and you live in a society where your job is to agree with the wealthy gentleman. You end up coming up with this story that says, yeah, yes, I was a witch, you know, and I quarrelled a goody so-and-so next door, and I decided I wanted to hurt her. So one day this fantastic man came to me and offered me all this wealth and all this happiness, and he said that I was special and that I was going to be his, and that he would reward me if I took revenge on goody so-and-so. So I did, and I felt fantastic about it. Now I can see that this was wrong. Please, can you absolve me, and then we can all go back to where we were. But of course it doesn't work like that. By the time you've made the confession, you're in such deep trouble that you're probably not going to get out of it. So I think that's one of the things that people might have been doing. It's all hypothesis, you know, it's all guesses. It's what I think after reading enough of these stories. But I do think there is attractiveness in these stories for the tellers. And I think that must be one of the reasons why they told these stories.
That's so interesting. I hadn't really considered it from that perspective at all, that in confessing there was sort of an agency that you were able to express a time when you had power and you were able to do something to people, and maybe so you'd better watch what you're doing because I'm in cahoots with the devil. And I did something to someone, and I suppose the underlying thing would be, and I could do it to you as well.
Yes, I think so. Somebody hears your voice, somebody hears you talk for a prolonged period of time. And imagine how satisfying that was in a society where people didn't really hear women talk a lot. They couldn't be in court, you know, not as a judge, as an advocate, as a lawyer. They couldn't be in the pulpit because they couldn't be ordained. They couldn't go to university. Nobody heard to speak. And unfortunately, one of the rooms that they might have is when somebody puts them in the dock and says, now tell us a story about how you're a witch. I do think it's that. And sometimes you also find even the judges are frightened of those women. You do find occasions where the judge records in memoirs or in a demonology, I thought that she could hurt me too. And that must have been a wonderfully satisfying position of power, even if it only lasted for, say, half an hour. Mm-hmm. It must have been transformative, mustn't it?
Do you think that it was sometimes the case in the confessions that the questioner had a story that they fed to the accused?
I think so, and certainly the underlying elements are going to be there. So you do see leading questions, and you see people reporting the leading questions that they asked with considerable pride because they don't see a problem with them. So they start off by saying, it's not a question of, you know, when did you become a witch, but how long have you been a witch? Which is a difficult one to answer, isn't it? There's nothing you can really say. It's like the old, you know, the example question is, when did you stop beating your wife? That's the leading question that everybody uses as an example.
Have you heard that in court, Claire?
No, I've heard that. It's such an old-fashioned, you know, phrase, but it's like the very thing that if you said that to somebody, they'd be like, because they can't say yes, they can't say no. is difficult. And if you add that on to people who haven't been sleeping for 3 days in a row.
On top of the humiliation as well, and the being stripped and searched, and knowing that your name would be mud and that everybody in your village or your town would know that you'd been accused, that like there couldn't be a much more stressful situation to construct, to have somebody say anything to make it stop.
No, I think that's right. And I do think it is about making it stop. So, you know, you get examples where the woman's been walked up and down and questioned for quite some time. And she actually says to her questions, if we can just sit down, I'll tell you. And you think, well, actually, you need to pay attention to the first part of that sentence, don't you? She said, if we could just sit down. Of course she has. And then she's going to tell you what, you know, she knows you want to hear. So, yeah, they're in a horrible situation, absolutely horrible and kind of inescapable at all sorts of levels, not just physical, but also mental. Like Claire's saying, what do you do with a question like that? There's no real answer, is there?
And are there any particular ideas that the public has that you would like them to stop holding, please? Are there any particular sort of myths that you think when you read it and you go, no, not again?
There are a couple, yeah, and I see them in student essays sometimes as well. Witches were not on the whole burned in this country, and that means both Scotland and England, and also Wales, and also Ireland. So there's that one. That's a kind of touchstone for me. When I see that in somebody's writing, I do start thinking, hang on. In some cases they were burned. So, you know, Effie McCallion, who's one of the North Berwick witches, was burned alive, and that's a horrible thing, and it's horrible. It has to be remembered.
Why was she burned alive and the others weren't?
Two reasons, really. One, she's accused of a kind of treason, so she's accused of working with the Earl of Bothwell against the king. Secondly, she's also accused of killing her husband. And you could be burned alive for killing your husband because it's regarded as petty treason, because you're the woman, right? And you're subject to your husband. So you can't kill your lord and husband. And if you do, you'll be burned.
God, I knew you could be for treason. I didn't realise there was such a thing as, wow.
Petty treason. So that's what happens to Effie. And there's another woman who's burned in Ipswich because she's regarded as having been a heretic. But they're burned for other reasons, not because they're witches. Witches are hanged, and this is, of course, no better. It's perhaps a slightly easier way to die in that it's quicker and it's far less spectacular. It's not the whole community coming together to burn a human being to death in the same way. So I'd like people to stop believing that all witches were burned and be a bit more reflective about why they might have been burned, because sometimes there's a really interesting story there, like we've just seen. And think about the others as being hanged because they were hanged as common criminals, and that also tells its own story. It means witchcraft was common. It was common like a theft. Thieves were hanged. It was common like a murder. Murderers were hanged. So they fall into the category felony. It's not something special in that way. It's just, oh yeah, here's another witch. Off she goes, let's hang her.
I think that's why it's so important that we try and have these people pardoned, because they were killed as it were, common witches. And I think that's really, really important. I know, Marion, not everyone agrees, particularly historians, that people should be pardoned for the crime of witchcraft. And we don't want you to agree just because you're on the show. It's fine. You can express your own views here. It's a safe place. What is your view on that?
Yeah, I find this really interesting because, you know, I think your campaign has changed my view. And I think that's really interesting, kind of looking at myself as a historical subject. You know, to start with, I thought, oh, that won't happen. You know, the government probably won't have time, it won't be interested, but actually they are, aren't they? That's really interesting. And I'm interested, of course, that it's a female leader who is interested in pardoning them. That seems to me to be quite important historically. I might have said, you know, that isn't really how history works. I might have said something about how they were convicted according to the standards of their time, which, you know, we might not agree with. And of course, as we've seen during the course of our conversation, you know, the evidence is badly flawed, the criminal proceedings are badly flawed, and so on. But now I think about it, you know, and I look at what you've done and I see some of the responses you've got, I think, why not? Maybe it is time to make these kind of historical gestures. And it isn't about rewriting history. It's about making new history. It's about a nation saying, actually, we kind of want it on the record that we don't do this. We don't do this here. And we don't believe this here. And I think it does set something of an international example as well. And you can see that with the case of Catalonia. People there in Catalonia also thinking about the idea of pardoning witches, partly because of this Scottish example. And if that can be extended to communities where people are still being accused of witchcraft and killed for it across the world, and there are many of them, well, that can only be a good thing. So I've really come round to the idea that this is actually a good thing to do.
That's very gratifying, Marion.
Absolutely, it is. That's such a lovely response. It really is. Thank you for that. And a lot of people, including colleagues that are in the law, when I started this, and Zoe and I started it, a lot of people said, this is silly, or, people are going to think you're crazy, and, people might not instruct you as a lawyer. And I was like, I don't care. It's an important thing to do. But a lot of people have come round. Many of my colleagues now go, I thought it was a joke when you started it, but I now actually understand. So it's brilliant. And the other thing is, what I feel really strongly about is we are somebody else's history. In 2,000 years' time, people are going to say, did they believe in witches in the 21st century? And I want them to be able to point to it and go, no, they were given a pardon. Because what seems like a crazy amount of time for us now, like 300, 400 years, in 1,000 or 2,000 years, it wouldn't matter. That'll just be talked about. The 19th and 20th century, like, it all happened in the 1 week. So I think it's important that we realise that we're people's history, and that we do something to put a marker down to say that it's not acceptable.
Yes, I like that idea. And I like the idea of its symbolism. Symbolism is important. People talk about empty symbols, don't they? Empty gestures. But there aren't any empty gestures. All gestures are meaningful. That's why we make them. So it does seem to me to be right. I'd love to see it happen. And that's partly because I think it's right, but it's partly also, yes, as a historian, I want to watch. I want to watch it happen. I want to see how it plays out. But I do think it's right, yes.
Absolutely brilliant. We can't wait, if it does happen, Marion, to be there celebrating with you.
Thanks.
That'll be great, won't it?
It's been really brilliant having you here today. You're really such a great speaker, and I'm so glad that we managed to actually get you on, because we know you've got a busy schedule yourself. So it was really great to have you here.
It's been a pleasure.
One thing going forward, people need to understand that women were not burnt at the stake.
Not on the whole.
For witchcraft. They were maybe for something else, for treason, or what did you say?
Petty treason.
Petty treason. Far out, man.
Grand treason was killing the king.
Yeah.
Treason was killing
your man.
Your king, your lord and master.
The domestic god.
There, I've given you something nasty to think about there.
Well, I'm teaching Macbeth at the moment to my third year kids in school. I'm an English teacher, and I'm enjoying it so much. And I think probably a lot more than they're enjoying it. But I'm really talking to them about the way that Lady Macbeth's presented. She's absolutely sort of that nature. Very, very interesting. And I think the whole thing about the way that women are portrayed and viewed, and it's still a case today. So I think it's still relevant from that perspective alone. But yes, it's been brilliant. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And lucky kids getting to hear you talk about witches.
Right. They just spend the whole time sitting with me performing Lady Macbeth, because I'm a completely frustrated actress.
And you're wringing your hands, Zoe.
It's got to that bit. It's brilliant. I'm loving it. And I just walk backwards and forwards and then give them hassle and then read another soliloquy. It's great. It's brilliant. Yeah, for me. Thank you so much, Marion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, ladies.
Thanks so much for listening again to the Witches of Scotland podcast. That's obviously 51 episodes into a series of 2 million. So that's great. We've actually got tons more guests lined up as well. Loads of really amazing people. It's just absolutely surprising endlessly to us that there are so many people working in this area doing really, really fascinating work in it.
And also, importantly, people that actually want to speak to us. That's the other surprising thing.
That is quite surprising, to be honest. But yeah, thank you so much for speaking to us and for keeping listening. Now, you'll remember, of course, that we have merchandise, and we also have the Buy Me a Coffee thing for David, who is our long-suffering, non-paid sound engineer who makes us sound slightly less, I was going to say clownish. That's maybe a bit hard.
Slightly less.
Of our
well,
past?
Yeah, well, slightly less exactly like we're being just now.
Yeah, rambly. It's good that we have the editing function of David, I think. Yeah. One time we should do an outtake, but it would just be stupid jokes that nobody else would get, probably.
Listen, one time we should do a live show.
Oh, we should totally do a live show. Let's see if we can get that up and running somewhere. It'd be nice if at some point we could do a kind of a tour around Britain and go and talk to guests on stage and meet some of the listeners that are so great at getting in touch. But do keep getting in touch with us on our socials, as the young folk say. Twitter, as I always say, is the best place to get a bit of a chat because we're much more responsive on there. We have got a Facebook page for info. We've got our Instagram. We've got
TikTok.
You haven't made another TikTok, have you?
I'm going to make another TikTok, Zoe. That's a threat.
That's good. I've got the ravens nearly trained, so it's slow progress, but they're coming along. The girls.
So you say.
Wait till you see the Raven show. It's going to be beautiful.
What are the names, Zoe?
I've not named them, Claire. That's demeaning. Ravens don't have names.
Okay, you've not named them, but you're training them. It's not demeaning to train them to say who's a pretty raven.
No, that's not what they're saying, Claire. Wait till you hear what they've got to say for themselves. No. They're intellectual ravens.
Zoe, are you teaching them feminist slogans?
Maybe
because
so.
I think come the feminist revolution, the ravens should be on our side.
Oh, they totally are. I mean, we have such great chats.
The raccoons, I'm not so sure about.
Yeah, they're the muscle. They're the muscle of the operation. They could have helped us to carry the cake to Barcelona. Damn it. We've really missed a trick on that one. Anyway, sorry, we're burbling again. Thanks so much for listening. Next week, we'll have another episode. Well, whenever it comes out. Fortnight?
A fortnight's time. We'll see you in episode 52 and you can continue to be amazed.
Cheesy peeps. Okay, thanks very much for listening. Goodbye.
If you'd like to learn more about the Witches of Scotland, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for our mailing list at www.witchesofscotland.com to keep updated with the campaign. On that site, you'll be able to find how to link with us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.